guys. Thank you for joining us. This is Chris Ehmke.
And this is Anthony.
Anthony, thanks for coming on the show short notice.
Dude, glad to be here. Glad to be here.
Sometimes, I can't rely on Paul.
No.
I can't do it. None of us
A lot of us can't, yeah.
It is what it is. Little recap. Last week, me and Paul talked about some of the differences through the generations of the Duramaxes. We covered LB7, the LLY, the LBZ. Some Duramax enthusiasts consider that the golden era of trucks just because they were, pre-def, pre-DPF, all the good stuff, but some of them had EGR. Mm-hmm. So I guess, let's just kind of, pick it up from there. We covered 01 to early 07 trucks. So that leaves us into the next RPO, which would be the LMM truck.
Yep, exactly.
So give our listeners a little bit of background. What changed in the LMM platform versus the LBZ platform?
I mean, the biggest thing, everyone's physically going to see, right, is the body change. I think when guys, especially if guys are calling... Mint body mod. It reminds me of when guys call in and they say they have an 07. The first thing we ask is it a classic or a new body style?
New body or old body.
Exactly. Yep. So you physically have, the interior's different, the body lines, everything's different. Yeah. And of course, the elephant in the room, it's the first generation of the DPF for those trucks.
So from an engine RPO standpoint, it goes from LBZ to LMM, a lot of similarities, as far as the engine architecture, the long block heads, even the ECM, it goes from an A to a B, the E35A, E35B, but the injector, they changed the nozzle count for emissions purposes. Yep. Similar EGR system, LBZ to LMM, and then they, like you said, introduced a DPF, and then a slightly smaller turbocharger, believe it or not, from the years. Similar power output, nothing really changed there. What's your take? Have you driven a lot of stock LMM trucks before, or have anything to compare to in that aspect?
Yes and no, and I say that because how many times have you seen an LMM that wasn't modified? At this rate, it's similar like you go to the older trucks. Like, when's the last time you drove an LB7 that didn't have a tune or didn't have anything on there? So, yes, I've driven them. It's been a while, but, in short, yes, I've driven enough LBZs to be able to compare the two. And like you're saying, they're very different, but they're also very similar. Yeah. You see a lot of aftermarket parts where it's like, okay, what RPOs do they fit? And they put LBZ/LMM.
Yep. No, I always, consider, I like the LMM platform myself. It's a cool truck. A couple of my close friends, as we started getting into this, had the LMM. So, it's like there's some familiarity to that. But from the Duramax enthusiast perspective, I've always kind of felt like the LMM is kind of like the black sheep of the family. Yeah. Like it's the first gen, DPF full emission truck, non-DEF yet, but DPF EGR. They were still trying to figure out some of the bugs, in some of the earlier trucks. So for a factory truck, like you drive it, not as impressive as the LBZ in any way, shape, or form.
Not
stock
at all.
To stock. But the truck itself kind of has its own place, I guess you could say, in the lineup. But it was really unique because, the LMM, they ran that from 07.5 to 10. No real changes throughout the years.
Not really, no.
All very similar. And then 2011 comes in the next RPO, which is the LML, and there's a ton of changes.
Massive, yeah.
With the LML. Body lines, like you mentioned in the LMM, that pretty much stayed the same from 11 to 14. In the LML world, there was a body line improvement, 15, 16. But, from 11 to 16, same body, same power plant. Engine trans. So, Allison 6-speed, 6.6 Duramax truck. What are some of the things that you think were different on those that the LMM didn't have, and what are some of the benefits and improvements over that platform?
A couple things I noticed, and I should say, being on the support side when I first started, I did all the switch installs. So, you physically have a different ECM. So, switch installs are totally different. The turbocharger's different. For the VVT and LML, you have a different compressor cover. You have a different bolt pattern for the backing plate. Physically, you can see the difference on the turbocharger. Yeah. And then, of course, again, the elephant in the room, you had the DPF with the LMM. Now you've got DEF on the 11 Plus trucks. Yep. Like you said, still an Allison 6-speed. There's that cutoff for the interior change or just truck change on 15, 16. So, there's a handful of physical changes, and then of course you fall into some of the maybe smaller stuff that kind of flies under the radar, under the hood that you typically wouldn't see.
Yeah. Some of the more technical stuff, from 01 to 10, they went to a solenoid-based Bosch injector, okay? And then in 2011 to 16, they went to a piezo injector. The way the electronic currents control that injector was different, and the piezo injector was actually a little bit more of a reliable injector, along with a little bit more of an accurate injector.
Yeah.
And you have the injector pump, right? We get a bunch of these calls in at the shop.
Absolutely.
From 01 to 16, 01 to 10, it was a CP3 pump. What changed in the 2011s?
Now we've got the CP4. I mean, everybody that I've ever talked to just absolutely loves the CP4. I think
with a smile on your face saying that,
exactly, right? I mean, I think you talk about referencing back to the LMM, you say it's like the black sheep of the family, right? Like even when I first saw them, I'm like, these trucks, I hate the body lines, but they hold a special place, I should say. And the CP4s do get a lot of shit in the aftermarket. I mean, that's why people have conversion kits. They have disaster kits. Yeah. Again, the guys over at Extra-G Performance have the fuel system savers. So 11 to 16 was the first, I should say, generation of the CP4. So, I mean, that's one of the big changes on the fuel system as well that everybody knows about.
No, and it's cool to look back on fuel systems and you think like the CP3 style injector pump was 01 to 10. And the injection pressure in a 01 to 05 truck was roughly like 23,000. And then in 06 to 2010, it went up to 26,000. Then the CP4 pump comes out, and now injection pressure is 29,000.
Yeah.
Right? So it's ramping up. And the CP4 pump was designed to support some of that higher volume or higher pressure. It just didn't have the volume support.
Yeah.
So some of the internal workings, just weren't robust enough. The filter, I think, is something to note in an LML because the DPF filter itself is literally twice the size of what it is in an LMM, and just the whole design of ninth injector in the downpipe for the after treatment. Then it goes into a catalytic converter, def injector, boom, into the filter itself. They really impressed a lot of the aftermarket with how that design is. And without getting too much shade, yes, there's issues with trucks, moving parts, this and that, but a lot of the issues that you saw in the LMMs didn't necessarily exist in the LMLs. Aside from the new introduced piece of equipment, which was the DEF system, which, we get calls on it, we get questions on it all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's something that it shows. Yes, the first generation had its issues in, keeping with that emissions theme. It shows that they learn, right? Yeah. They take the feedback, they realize, hey, here's the pitfalls, here's the shortcomings, how can we make that, essentially better, how can we improve on that? And I think regardless of the platform, we've seen that from all the manufacturers moving forward into the newer stuff every single year.
Yeah. So the LML platform then, that ended in 2016? Okay. What happened after?
Now we got the L5P. Now we got a different power plant. I mean, we have a different turbocharger, different injector style. Like again, we're swapping the RPO, so I mean, a lot of things are going to be changing that year. I mean, it's going to carry the same body style, other than the hood is the big thing. You have the whole hood scoop. You can see that right on the front.
Pretty nasty looking.
Pretty aggressive looking, especially with a nice set of wheels and tires. It'll offset that nice. But you have the different motor. You still have the 6-speed Allison up until 19. I mean, that's the first generation of L5P. You have a different. You don't have the CP4 anymore. You have the HP4 pump, and I really don't hear a lot of issues about those. Yeah. I know. there's no like disaster kits or anything like that. So right. I mean, it's a pretty robust platform from everything we've seen and everything that I've heard and we've done.
Some of the technical stuff there. You think back at the 01 to 16. 04.5 through 16 all ran Garrett variable vane turbos. Prior to that, it was the iHigh and the LB7. And in the L5P platform, 17 plus, they go to a Borg Warner, right? With a big old solenoid, actuator sitting on top. The turbocharger is very unconventional compared to some of the other trucks. The cool thing I always saw is they have, instead of the exhaust housing being part of the pedestal, they actually have a pedestal in the valley, and then the turbo mounts to that pedestal, which we've seen with the techs here at the shop. It makes the truck a little bit more service friendly. Yeah. Servicing that. The turbocharger doesn't sit directly in the back of the motor. It actually sits in the middle of the engine, so it's a little bit easier to get to. They go to a solenoid base injector again from the piezo style. So they ran the piezo specific in the LML, but the HP4 pump, they still run that at a much higher injection pressure, similar to the LML. Yeah,
I mean, you're going to be up on the 30,000s or around that point. I mean, every truck now, I feel like pressures get higher and higher every RPO
for atomization. If that's everything, they downsize the filter, the DPF. So the filters actually come down some. But in theory, you know, as you are able to crank up injection pressure and you're able to atomize the fuel, you're hoping for a cleaner burn. So the canister, the filter doesn't have to be as big. The EGR system is pretty robust on that thing. One thing that, you know, until you see an engine on the stand and you really start to understand the makeup and the architecture of it, you know, you don't truly get to see that in black and white. But in the older trucks, you have the EGR attached to the up-pipe, right? In the L5P, the EGR cooler attaches to the manifold on the passenger side.
Yeah, it's pretty, I mean, like you said, until you see it out of the motor, like on an engine stand, it's neat to see the architecture design. Because, I mean, I think a lot of us before the L5P came out had that, okay, they've been doing the same thing for so long.
6.6 liter, it is what it is.
Exactly, it is what it is. You know, that's what it's going to be, and then they come out with this whole different design, and then the intake plenum is totally different as well. Yep. You talk about the cylinder and the turbo. The vane has a cage this time instead of just sitting on the exhaust housing of the turbocharger. They redesigned a whole bunch of stuff on there, and it's neat to see it. Yeah.
So that's 17-19. You still have a 6-speed Allison, right? 6-speed Allison been in those trucks for years, you know, from 06 to, you know, 19, right? And then 2020 comes, right? L5P still, but it comes with the 10-speed. So new body, revamp, right? But we go to a 10-speed Allison, and that trans is a joint venture between GM and Ford, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
We've played with those transmissions over at the shop here for a few years now, especially on the Ford side of things. Played with some shift kits and whatnot on the GM side, since the controller for the GM isn't supported at this point in time. You know, I'll start with my first impression, you know, coming from earlier trucks. You know, you get into a 5-speed to a 6-speed, it's like, oh, there's that extra gear, there's more movement, right? Now you go from a 6-speed to a 10-speed. Like, for me, it's really hard to kind of get used to it. There's always something going on down there. Yeah.
No, I'd agree. You have that giant, I mean, I'll call it a giant jump. You have a different trans. You have a different body style. One, you're getting used to a whole different feel in, I should say, style of a truck.
Yeah.
Then factor in the 10-speed. I mean, you know, like we always talk about, we have the tuning and support for something that is still relatively new, and you know, like, you can't go and tune one of those transes. You're not pulling the trans out of a truck and doing a whole built unit. Guys are starting to do it, but it's not as, you know, popular as a predecessor.
Yeah. No, and I mean, and as these trucks have grown, you know, power output from the factory has been a big thing in torque, and that's something that we've seen, you know, over the years with these things. Looking back at it now, if you had a guy that would call in on the phone and say, hey, you know, I'm new to diesel, money isn't the option, I'll buy an old truck and revamp it to new, or I'll buy a new truck, what would be a platform that you would generally recommend someone to go towards, and why? Let's say they're hands-on, they want a tow, they want a good, fun driver, they're looking for, you know, they want their cake and eat it too, more or less.
Yes. I mean, in terms of the old school in me with my LOI is like, dude, units. But if like you're saying, if money's not an option, I would say the 17 to 19 trucks, in my personal opinion. I mean, you get the benefits of being able to build a trans if you ever need to. And you still, like, you have that, you know, it's a 6-speed, you go back to the old roots. In how many trucks can you tune, or just take the old, compared to the older ones, you can't tune an LOI or an LB7, LBZ, LMM, and you can't make 500 horse on a tune and have it live and breathe there.
Yeah.
You do that on the 17 to 19. I mean, let's say just you throw the 15, 16 LMLs in there where you can change up the line pressure, you can improve the efficiency of the trans. I mean, if there's something that's going to live at 500 horse, it's going to tow, be stout, and be able to live there, like, I think the 17 to 19 trucks have that in the bag, in my opinion.
No, we get this question all the time, right? And I would tend to agree. I've always liked the 15-19 body style. It's got to have the 17 plus hood, though.
Oh, yeah.
I love the hood
got to have the scoop.
But the L5P platform is probably my favorite, you know, through and through. But if we were talking older truck, like, I've always been a go-to on the LOI, you know, platform, just because generally speaking, you can get those trucks a little cheaper than you're going to get an LBZ for. You still get some of that newer technology, like we talked in the prior episode, and you can modernize that truck. You could do a 6-speed, you could do a slightly tighter turbo for spool up, you know, different intakes, stuff like that. You know, but it's crazy how all of these platforms, as we've gone through this, have changed so much, yet there are still some similarities, and a lot of similarities in driving characteristics, operating style of the truck as a whole. Right?
No, I would totally agree. Like you're saying, the modernization of the older ones. I mean, take my truck. I know we've talked about it a little bit. I mean, when was the last time you were able to secure an almost rust-free LOY crew cab short bed for under 15? I mean,
that pre-COVID, unfortunately.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I put a 6-speed in mine, built a trans, put a turbo. I mean, it's a 600-horse truck.
But now you have a dubbed LBZ truck at that point.
Exactly.
And there was always a lot of talk behind the scenes years ago. You wanted a Victory Red LBZ. Like, that's what you wanted. Mm-hmm. Instead, we found a Victory Red LOY for literally half the cost.
Threw a 6-speed in there and call it a day.
And we go drive 5 hours south to go, pick the thing up. And, it's just, it's one of those where there's value in any platform, I feel. It's just, we'll get the guys that call like, oh, what are the weak links here? And I want the bulletproof truck. I don't want any problems. It's like, live in a bubble then? I don't know what to tell you. Like, every platform is going to have its problems.
And it's those phone calls where, like, I should say, we come from a background where we know the shortcomings, we know all the modifications. So when someone calls and like, oh, what truck should I get? It's like, well, I can't tell you that. Yep. It's like, if you come to me with an RPO or I'm looking at these, I can tell you what modifications are going to make that thing great, what's going to tow good, what's going to be fun to drive. Well, essentially with any RPO. So just being able to kind of condense on what you're after, anything could be where you want it to. It's just a matter of what you're after.
And I think with that, there's a lot of avenues to go down to making any of these trucks, a little bit more on the reliable bulletproof side. You think of even the sponsors that we have on the show, Exergy Performance. They offer parts for all the different years from, regulators, disaster kits, injector replacements, rails, lines, sensors, you name it.
Yeah.
Or XDP, for fuel additive stuff. They could be your one-stop shop for any of those types of things for resources and parts and knowledge. Or WC Fab. I don't know anyone that talks about Duramaxes and doesn't mention WC Fab in that.
Definitely one of the biggest names in the industry for those trucks.
And then where we work, we've seen all the trucks. We've ran all the different trucks through the ringer over at Calibrated Power Duramax Tuner. If you're, asking or have interest in what RPO to go with or some of those shortcomings, they can always reach out over to us at the shop. If I can probably assure that if it's a problem, we've seen it or we've encountered it in the past. Mm-hmm. So, it's just it's nice to have that type of knowledge and that background there.
Yeah, being able to help coach guys too, and kind of what questions they might have, is just being able to help them, right? Because with all the different RPOs, with all the different questions, everything people might have, being able to guide them, because we all know how much misinformation is out in the market space with guys calling. It's like, oh, well, my buddy told me this. I was like, you better quit talking to your buddy, man. He doesn't know what he's talking to.
I just went on the forum and, I was reading all night and I came across this and, they said that if I stick a nail in my second injector on my LOY, that's going to, make the injector fire. Should I buy a new cable or a new harness, for that injector pigtail? Yes. Don't drive the truck with that nail. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of misluded information out there, I unfortunately feel. And, there are resources, like I mentioned, that guys can lean on to say, hey, I'm new to this. They listen to the podcast, for example, right? Like, thank you, everyone that does listen. But there are avenues for the new upcomers to kind of lean on to say, hey, trucks are not getting cheaper. Parts to replace, what's broken isn't getting any cheaper. Make the educated decision and,
do it right the first time.
People have spent, look at your LB7. Remember your old LB7?
Oh, I remember that thing.
Spent money on that and then you did it right the second time.
Learn my lesson, that's for sure.
What do you think the future of diesel looks like? Like, there's this talk, there's been some buzz going on as far as what the new interior looks like in the 2024 HD Chevys. We've covered, basically 23 years of platforms, being 01 all the way through 23 with the L5P. We already know that the 24s are going to be different. So what do you think is going to change, and what do you think some of those, some of those highlights are going to look like?
I think physically, I think they're going to carry over the body close enough to, for the next couple of years. From what I've seen, there's some teaser shots floating around. The interior, I feel like every time they come up with a new RPO on these trucks, it's like we're more and more in a spaceship.
Yeah.
The interior is always going to get revamped. The screens get bigger and bigger. Everything is more electronically controlled. I think we're still gonna have the roots of the 6.6 Duramax. It's going to be a stout platform. It's going to be very strong in stock form. They're just going to keep growing with everything newer and newer, but we're still going to have what we all know and love for the Duramax platform: something strong, reliable, tow with, offer plenty of performance upgrades, and something you can rely on.
Yeah. What do you think it's going to do for ECM architecture and stuff like that and tuning?
every year seems a little bit harder and harder
Yeah.
to get into it. I mean, we're fortunate enough to work with a lot of companies who can help, pave the way where we can get access to the ECM and offer custom calibrations for these guys. So, I mean, with anything, what I've seen over the past few years, it's going to take a little bit of time before we can get into them. So, I mean, things are going to get more and more difficult, but we have yet to find one that we can't get into.
Think it's going to be a 500 horsepower platform out of the factory?
That'd be cool. I mean, I think maybe not 500 right out of the gate, but
Yeah.
I think the average is over 400 now. So, I mean, I would see 450 pretty consistently, I'd say.
You think there's going to be a 12-speed trans? I mean, we're already at
Might
10.
as well make it 20 speed
Right?
at this point.
Like, just keep it clicking.
Jesus. What do you think, Chris? Let me ask you that.
I think that they're going to hold on the 10-speed for a while. I do believe that 24 will be, if not a new engine, it's going to be a new ECM. I think there's going to be some changes there. I think that there is going to be the race to 500 horsepower. It's just naturally kind of behind the scenes with some of the Ford uprates over the last couple of years that we've seen in the 20 versus 21 versus 22. I think 2024, you're going to see that 500 horsepower out of the gate.
Okay.
GM, I'll be honest, like the interior was a long thing coming, man, because I'm not a fan of the 20 to 24 23 stuff. So some of the spy shots and snapshots that I've seen of the 24 stuff, it's like, all right,
it's about damn time,
I like
right?
that. That looks real nice.
It does look sharp.
But I think what I'm most excited on once that platform comes out is you're going to have this rush of new trucks, and you're going to see repurposed new owners of the 17 to 19 era and new repurposed owners in the 20 to 23 era. And since these trucks are still new, like we've seen some higher mileage trucks come in and out of the shop, but I think the next wave of platforms is going to give a lot of us in the aftermarket a new opportunity to, kind of revisit some of those platforms, see what those shortcomings are. If someone were to call in with an LBZ or an LOY truck, like we know how to diagnose those issues. We've seen something or, either that specific or something similar. A lot of what you have in the L5P space is a little bit more uncertain. So I think as more of those trucks start to get some miles, new owners take on those trucks, some of those issues start to kind of surface. We're going to kind of be a little bit more honed in on what that platform is truly capable of.
Yeah, totally agree. And more miles, the more scenarios you're going to run into.
Yeah.
I mean, it took time for the older trucks to develop, hey, this is what you got going on here.
0087 under a load, right?
Exactly.
With injectors and stuff like that. So.
735, I'm sure, took how long before someone's like, oh, shit, the trans is slipping. You got to build it. So, I mean, we're slowly seeing that stuff. I mean, Nick did a nice video on the L5P, the injector harness, I believe, injector number 4. So, I mean, that's something, 2-3 years ago, guys were...
That wasn't a thing?
Yeah,
No.
Guys weren't seeing that.
No.
I think the first time we saw it, truck already had 200,000 rounds on it or something high up there. So we're going to start seeing that stuff slowly but surely. Like you're saying, the repurposed owners, we're going to see different things, and then that's going to help grow the aftermarket as well.
Very good. Well, guys, we appreciate you listening. This was Chris.
And this is Anthony.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us today, guys. This has been Paul Wilson.
And Chris Ehmke.
Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Especially if guys
Mint
are calling
body
it,
mod.
mint body mod.